He was just another old veteran in a military courtroom. Gray hair, worn suit, forgettable face. The attorney dismissed his testimony as outdated, barely looked at his file. Then she read the classified section, and her hands started shaking. Before we reveal what she found in that file, don't forget to subscribe. The courtroom at Joint Base Andrews was cold that morning. March rain hammered against the tall windows, and the fluorescent lights buzzed in that particular way that made everything feel clinical, temporary, like the truth didn't matter as much as procedure. Captain Marcus Webb sat in the witness chair, 68 years old, hands folded in his lap. He wore a gray suit that looked like it came from a department store in 1995, and the collar of his white shirt was slightly frayed. His hair was the color of old paper, thinning at the crown, and his face carried the deep lines of a man who'd spent too much time squinting into the sun or into something worse. He said nothing, just waited. Across the room, Captain Jennifer Oakes stood at the defense table, flipping through documents with the kind of impatient energy that comes from being 32 and believing you've already figured everything out. She was sharp, everyone said so. Graduated top of her class at JAG school, 3 years of trials under her belt, and she'd won most of them. This case, a discharge appeal for a Special Forces sergeant accused of disobeying direct orders during a classified operation, should have been straightforward, should have been over in 2 days. Then the prosecution called Marcus Webb. Captain Oakes glanced at his service record, printed on standard military letterhead, dates of service 1978 to 1983, 5 years, no combat decorations listed, no special qualifications, just a basic honorable discharge and a forwarding address in rural Pennsylvania. She looked up at the judge, made a gesture of dismissal with her hand, and spoke with the kind of confidence that comes from never having been wrong before. She said his testimony was irrelevant, said his service ended 40 years ago, said he had no knowledge of current operational procedures, no connection to the defendant, said his presence was a waste of the court's time. Marcus didn't react, didn't shift in his seat, didn't look at her. He just kept his eyes on the judge, calm and steady, like a man who'd learned a long time ago that silence was safer than speech. The judge, a colonel with 30 years of his own service, glanced at the prosecution, asked if they wanted to respond. Major Daniel Reyes stood, mid-40s, lean, the kind of man who ran 10 miles before breakfast and still showed up looking like he'd slept 12 hours. He didn't smile often, but when he did, it usually meant he knew something you didn't. He was smiling now. He told the judge that Captain Webb's testimony was directly relevant to the charges, that the operation in question, the one Sergeant Harlan was accused of abandoning, bore significant tactical similarities to a mission conducted in 1981, a mission Captain Webb participated in, a mission that until 6 weeks ago remained sealed under executive order. Captain Oakes blinked, started to object, but the judge cut her off, told her to sit down, told Captain Webb he could proceed. Marcus nodded once, slow, like he'd expected this, like he'd been waiting for it. Major Reyes approached the witness chair. He didn't rush, didn't perform. He just walked up, hands loose at his sides, and stood there for a moment, looking at Marcus the way you might look at a photograph you thought you'd lost. He asked where Marcus was on November 14th, 1981. Marcus's voice was rougher than you'd expect, gravel under tires. Iran. One word. The room went still. Reyes asked him to be more specific. Marcus said Tehran, or near it, said the exact location was still classified. Reyes nodded, handed a folder to the clerk, said the declassification order was inside, said it had been unsealed 6 weeks ago. The judge opened it, read. His expression didn't change, but something shifted behind his eyes, something that looked like recognition, or maybe respect. He told Reyes to continue. Reyes turned back to Marcus, asked what his mission was that day. Marcus took a slow breath, let it out, said it was an extraction, 3 American engineers taken hostage 8 days prior. Intel said they were being moved to a secondary location. They had a 4-hour window, maybe less. Reyes asked who the team was. Marcus said 6 operators, then stopped, corrected himself, said 5 of them were still alive. The courtroom was silent except for the rain. Reyes asked what happened. Marcus's hands tightened slightly in his lap, not much, just enough to notice if you were watching. He said they reached the target building at 0200 hours, said the intel was good. The hostages were there, but so was a full security detail they hadn't been briefed on. 12 armed guards, RPGs, heavy machine gun on the roof. Reyes asked what he did. Marcus said their orders were to abort if the situation exceeded mission parameters, said this exceeded them, said he radioed command, requested permission to proceed anyway. Reyes asked what command said. Denied. Marcus said it was a direct order to extract and return to base. Reyes asked what he did next. Marcus looked at him, then at the judge, then at Captain Oakes, who was staring at him now with an expression that wasn't quite anger anymore, wasn't quite anything. Disobeyed, Marcus said. Went in anyway. The words hung in the air, heavy, unforgivable by the letter of military law. Captain Oakes opened her mouth, then closed it. She could feel where this was going, could see the trap she'd walked into, but it was too late to step back. Reyes asked what the result was. Marcus said all 3 hostages recovered, alive, minor injuries. Said they took casualties, 2 wounded, 1 killed in action. Sergeant David Mercer, 26 years old, married, 2 kids. His voice hitched when he said the name, just barely, like a crack in stone that had been holding for decades. Reyes asked about the guards. Marcus said they were neutralized. Reyes asked if all 12 were neutralized. Yes, sir. Reyes turned to the judge, told him the mission Marcus was describing, Operation Granite Shadow, was one of the most successful hostage rescues of the Cold War. Said it prevented an international incident that could have escalated into armed conflict. Said the 3 engineers Marcus saved went on to design key components of the early missile defense systems. Said one of them later became the Deputy Secretary of Defense. The judge nodded slowly, said he was aware of Granite Shadow, said he'd read about it in the intelligence brief last month when it was declassified. Reyes continued, said Captain Webb was court-martialed for disobeying direct orders, said he spent 6 months in military prison, said his record was sealed, his service erased from official channels, his career destroyed, even though he saved 3 American lives and prevented a war. Captain Oakes stood, started to speak, but the judge's voice cut through the room like steel, told her to sit down. She sat. The judge looked at Marcus, asked why he refused the pardon that was offered after his court-martial, asked why he wouldn't sign the non-disclosure agreement. Marcus's jaw worked for a moment, like he was chewing on words he'd swallowed a long time ago. Pardon implies guilt, he said. Wasn't guilty, made the right call. Would do it again. The judge asked if he'd make the same choice even knowing it would cost him everything. Yes, sir. The judge nodded, didn't smile, but something in his expression softened, thanked him, told him he could step down. Marcus stood, his knees made a sound like old wood settling, and he walked back toward the gallery, past Captain Oakes, past Major Reyes, past the rows of silent faces. He moved like a man who'd carried weight for so long he didn't remember what it felt like to be light. As he passed the defense table, Captain Oakes reached out, not to stop him, just her hand hovered in the air for a second, like she wanted to say something but didn't have the words. Marcus paused, looked at her, his eyes pale blue, faded, but steady. He said her father's name was Oakes, first name Thomas. She blinked, started to ask how he knew, but he continued before she could finish. He said Thomas was one of the engineers, the youngest, 23 years old when they pulled him out of that building. Said he had a photo of his wife in his pocket, said she was pregnant, due in 2 months. Captain Oakes's breath caught, her hand dropped to the table. She said that was her mother, said she was born in January 1982, said her father died 5 years ago, said he never told her. Marcus said he wasn't allowed to, said the NDA covered everyone involved, hostages included, said Thomas probably wanted to tell her, but couldn't. She stared at him, this old man in his worn suit and frayed collar, this ghost of a soldier who'd saved her father's life before she was even born. Marcus didn't wait for a response, he just turned and walked toward the exit, slow and deliberate, his boots making soft sounds against the polished floor, and the room stayed silent until the door closed behind him, leaving nothing but the rain and the weight of what had just been said. Captain Oakes sat at the defense table for a long time after the courtroom cleared, staring at the service record she'd dismissed an hour earlier. The one that said 5 years, the one that said nothing about medals, nothing about sacrifice. Nothing about the night her father came home alive because a man she'd never met decided orders were worth less than lives. She flipped to the last page, the one she hadn't bothered to read before, the one with the black bars covering every line, the classified section, the section that had just been unsealed 6 weeks ago. She read it now, slowly, carefully, and her hand started shaking. It said Marcus Webb had participated in 17 classified operations between 1979 and 1983. Operations with no official record, no paper trail, no recognition. It said he'd been wounded 4 times, refused medical evacuation 3 times, carried 6 men out of hostile zones under fire, and disobeyed direct orders twice, both times to save American lives. It said his file had been sealed by presidential order, not for security reasons, but because the truth was too damaging, because admitting that a decorated operator had been court-martialed for doing the right thing would have been politically untenable. It said he'd been offered reinstatement, full rank, full honors, and had refused. said he didn't want recognition, didn't want medals, didn't want his name on any wall. He just wanted to be left alone. Captain Oaks's hands trembled as she closed the file. She thought about the way she'd dismissed him, the way she'd gestured at him like he was wasting her time, the way she'd called his testimony irrelevant. She thought about her father, the man who'd come home from a business trip to Tehran in 1981 and never spoke about what happened, the man who'd woken up screaming some nights for years afterward, the man who'd held her as a baby with hands that trembled sometimes for no reason she could understand. And now she understood. Because Marcus Webb had carried her father out of hell, and she'd treated him like he was nobody. The afternoon light was fading when she finally left the courthouse. The rain had stopped, but the air still smelled like wet concrete and exhaust. She sat in her car for 20 minutes, staring at the service record in her hands, reading the classified section over and over, trying to understand how a man could give everything and receive nothing, how the system could erase someone who'd saved lives, how she'd been so blind, so arrogant, so certain she knew better. She thought about calling someone, her supervisor maybe, or one of the senior attorneys who'd been practicing military law longer than she'd been alive. But what would she say? That she'd dismissed a witness without reading his file, that she'd mocked a man who'd saved her father's life, that she'd been so focused on winning she'd forgotten what justice actually meant. So she didn't call anyone. She just started driving. The address on his service record led her 2 hours west, out of the city, past the suburbs, into the kind of countryside where houses sit a mile apart, and mailboxes lean at angles that suggest they've been hit by snowplows, more times than anyone's bothered counting. The road turned to gravel after the last gas station, and the trees closed in on both sides, tall pines that blocked what was left of the sunlight. She almost missed the driveway, just 2 tire tracks through the grass with a faded mailbox that said Webb in letters that had once been white. The house was small, 1 story, white paint peeling in places, a porch with 2 rocking chairs and a view of nothing but woods, no neighbors, no street lights, no sound except wind in the branches and the crunch of her shoes on gravel as she walked toward the door. She knocked, waited, heard nothing inside, knocked again, harder this time, still nothing. She tried the handle, locked, walked around the side of the house, past a woodpile stacked neatly against the wall, past a garden that had been tended recently, tomatoes still on the vine, past a rusted pickup truck that looked like it hadn't moved in months. She found him in the back, sitting on a wooden bench under an oak tree, staring out at the woods, a thermos of coffee beside him, his hands folded in his lap, the same way they'd been in the courtroom, the same way they'd probably been for the last 40 years, waiting, watching, carrying weight no one else could see. He didn't turn when she approached, didn't acknowledge her, just kept staring at the trees like they held answers he'd been searching for. She stood there for a moment, unsure how to begin, unsure if she even had the right to be there. Finally she spoke, said she was sorry, said she didn't know, said she should have read the file, should have listened, should have understood. Marcus didn't respond. She waited. The silence stretched out, long and uncomfortable, and she was about to leave when he finally spoke. "Your father ever tell you about the photo?" She blinked, shook her head. Marcus nodded, like he'd expected that. He said Thomas had pulled it out when they were pinned down, said he'd shown it to Marcus in the dark, said it was his wife, said she was pregnant, said he wanted someone to know in case he didn't make it. Marcus said he'd promised Thomas he'd get him home, promised he'd make sure that baby got a father, even if it meant disobeying orders, even if it meant ending his own career. Kept that promise, Marcus said quietly. Captain Oaks felt tears sting her eyes, felt her throat tighten, felt the weight of decades of silence pressing down on her. She asked why he never told anyone, why he never fought back, why he let them erase him. Marcus was quiet for a long time, long enough that she thought maybe he wasn't going to answer, long enough that she started wondering if coming here had been a mistake, if she should just leave him alone the way everyone else had for the past 40 years. But then he spoke, his voice quiet, rougher than it had been in the courtroom, like it cost him something to use it out here where no one was listening. "Your father ever tell you about the photo?" She blinked, shook her head, didn't trust her voice yet. Marcus nodded, like he'd expected that, like he'd known Thomas Oaks had kept his promise, had stayed silent, had carried the weight of that night alone until the day he died. Marcus said Thomas had pulled it out when they were pinned down, said they'd been trapped in a basement for 6 hours, guards on every floor, RPGs hitting the walls above them, said Thomas was bleeding from shrapnel in his shoulder, said he was going into shock, said he'd pulled out this crumpled photograph, creased and stained with dirt, showed it to Marcus in the dark, his hands shaking, said it was his wife, said she was pregnant, said her name was Ellen, said he wanted someone to know in case he didn't make it, wanted someone to tell her he'd tried, that he'd fought, that his last thought was of her and the baby he'd never meet. Marcus said he'd promised Thomas he'd get him home, promised he'd make sure that baby got a father, even if it meant disobeying orders, even if it meant ending his own career, even if it meant carrying him out on his back through 2 miles of hostile territory, while guards fired from every rooftop and every window, said he'd kept that promise, kept it when command told him to abort, kept it when his team leader said they were outnumbered, kept it when his own leg was bleeding and his vision was blurring, and every step felt like the last one he'd ever take. "Kept that promise," Marcus said quietly, and his voice carried something Captain Oakes hadn't heard before. Not regret exactly, not pride either, just the weight of knowing he'd made a choice that cost him everything and saved a life that mattered more than his own career ever would. She asked if he ever regretted it. Marcus looked at her for the first time since she'd arrived, his pale blue eyes steady and clear. "No," he said. She nodded, wiped her eyes, thanked him, and turned to leave. Marcus called after her, told her to tell the truth in her closing argument, told her to do the right thing, even if it cost her. She stopped, looked back, asked what he meant. Marcus said the sergeant she was defending, Sergeant Harlan, had made the same choice Marcus had made 40 years ago, had disobeyed orders to save lives, and was being punished for it. Said the system hadn't learned anything, said some things never change. He told her to fight for Harlan the way no one had fought for him. "Do better," he said. She nodded, walked back to her car, and drove away, leaving Marcus alone on the bench, surrounded by trees and silence, a man who'd given everything and asked for nothing, a man who'd been erased from history but had never stopped serving, never stopped keeping promises, never stopped doing what was right, even when no one was watching. The trial resumed 2 days later, and Captain Oakes stood before the judge with a different energy, a different purpose. She presented evidence she'd uncovered, testimony from soldiers who'd served with Sergeant Harlan, declassified mission reports that showed his actions had saved 8 lives, just like Marcus had saved 3. She argued that disobeying orders to save American lives wasn't a crime. It was the highest form of service, that punishing soldiers for choosing lives over protocol was a betrayal of everything the military stood for. The courtroom was silent when she finished, the kind of silence that comes from truth hitting harder than anyone expected. The judge deliberated for an hour, then returned with his verdict. He said Sergeant Harlan's actions, while technically in violation of direct orders, were justified by the circumstances, said the charges were dismissed, said his record would be cleared, his rank restored, his service honored. The courtroom erupted in applause, and Captain Oakes stood there, numb, realizing she'd just won the case Marcus Webb should have won 40 years ago. After the trial, she drove back to the house in Pennsylvania, knocked on the door, no answer, walked around back, found the bench empty, the thermos gone, just the woods and the wind and the feeling that she'd arrived too late. She left a note on the door, thanked him for teaching her what honor really meant, thanked him for saving her father, thanked him for never giving up on doing what was right. She never saw him again. But 6 months later, on a Tuesday morning when the leaves were starting to turn, she received a package in the mail. No return address, just her name written in careful block letters on brown paper. Inside was a small wooden box, simple, unvarnished, the kind you might make in a high school shop class. She opened it slowly, not sure what she expected to find. Inside was a faded photograph, edges worn soft from handling. 8 men in the desert, arms slung over shoulders, dust-caked and sunburned, smiling the way men smile when they've survived something they probably shouldn't have. Marcus Webb was in the center, younger then, his hair still dark, but his eyes were the same, that same steady calm. On the back, in handwriting that looked decades old, faded ink on fading paper, was a single line. "Some promises are worth everything." She framed it, hung it in her office between her law degree and her commission certificate, and every time she looked at it, every time a case felt too hard or the system felt too broken, she remembered the man who'd been dismissed, erased, forgotten, but who'd never stopped keeping his word, never stopped saving lives, never stopped serving, even when the world stopped noticing, even when there was no one left to thank him, even when the only reward was knowing that somewhere a baby had grown up with a father because one night in Tehran, a soldier had decided orders were worth less than lives. Captain Jennifer Oakes went on to try 43 more cases in her career, won most of them, lost a few, and never once dismissed a witness without reading their entire file. She became known for her thoroughness, her insistence that every veteran who testified in her courtroom be treated with the respect they'd earned. Some colleagues called her rigid, said she wasted time on witnesses who didn't matter, but she didn't care, because she'd learned the hard way that you never know who matters until it's too late. She never saw Marcus Webb again, never found out if he received the letter she'd left on his door, never knew if he read about Sergeant Harlan's acquittal, never knew if he understood that his testimony had changed everything. Years later, teaching a seminar at Georgetown, a student asked what the most important lesson she'd learned in her career was. She thought about all the cases, all the trials, all the moments when she'd felt like she was making a difference or failing completely. She told them about Marcus Webb, about the old man in the gray suit who'd been dismissed by a young attorney who thought she knew better, about the testimony declared irrelevant, about the file classified for 40 years, about the 3 lives saved and the 1 career destroyed, about the father who'd come home to meet his daughter because a soldier had disobeyed orders and paid the price. She told them that sometimes the most important witnesses are the ones no one wants to hear, the ones who make you uncomfortable, the ones who force you to question whether the system is working or just moving, processing, filing, forgetting. The students were quiet when she finished, the kind of quiet that comes from understanding something for the first time. One of them asked if she ever found out what happened to Marcus Webb, if he was still alive, if anyone had thanked him. She said she didn't know, said she'd tried to find him once, had driven back to the house in Pennsylvania, had found it empty, no furniture, no truck, no trace anyone had lived there. Just an empty house surrounded by trees and silence, the kind of place people go when they want to disappear. She said she hoped he was okay, hoped he'd found peace, hoped he knew his testimony had mattered, that Sergeant Harlan had been acquitted, that his sacrifice hadn't been for nothing. But mostly she hoped that wherever he wasn't alone, that someone had found him, that someone had said thank you, not for medals he didn't have or recognition he'd refused, but for keeping promises when no one was watching, for saving lives when it cost everything, for being the kind of soldier who knew that honor wasn't about glory, it was about doing the right thing even when the right thing destroyed you. The photograph still hangs in her office, a reminder that sometimes the most important stories are the ones no one tells, the ones that get classified and sealed and forgotten. And every time she looks at those 8 men smiling in the desert, she remembers Marcus Webb, and she reminds herself that justice isn't about procedure, it's about people. And sometimes the most important thing you can do is just read the file, all of it, because that's where the truth lives, in the spaces between the words, in the silence that follows testimony, in the stories no one wants to hear but everyone needs to remember. So now I ask you, have you ever met someone like Marcus Webb, someone who gave everything, asked for nothing, carried promises the world never knew about, someone who was dismissed, overlooked, erased but never stopped serving? Share their name in the comments. Tell us what they taught you, because here on The Human Stories, we honor the ones who don't ask for recognition, only for respect. Thank you for watching. If this story moved you, share it, subscribe, help us keep alive the quiet power of those who never stopped serving, even when the world stopped watching. And next time you see an old veteran in a courtroom, or anywhere else, remember, you might be looking at someone who saved lives you'll never know about.